2020, the Black Lives Matter movement has brought Britain's imperial past into sharp focus, with statues falling and mass protests taking place. Shut it down! But are there still parts of this country's colonial actions that remain taboo? As a Palestinian, I've long felt that our history has been marginalised, and more recently, maybe even silenced. Growing up between Palestine and Britain, I've seen different ways in which people's lives and histories are sidelined. In recent years, this has got worse, with US policies under Donald Trump, including moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, undermining Palestinian rights. As an active campaigner engaged in discussions on colonialism, I've long felt Britain has been too silent about human rights abuses, and I wanted to know if other Palestinians living here share my experience. Can you tell me from your experience what it's like to be a Palestinian living in Britain?
You're asked sometimes, okay, where are you from? And you answer, I'm Palestinian. The other person will be like, oh, we shouldn't get too political. And you just said, I'm Palestinian. There is this taboo around it that people that are not aware of it are scared of even tapping into that discussion.
I think there's like an acceptable way to be Palestinian where it's like, I just really like to make falafel and like listen to like Fairuz. But as soon as you want to talk about anything that's real, like Gaza or the right of return or, international law and human rights, that's like, no, you can't be that kind of a Palestinian.
My experience as someone who's grown up here is this sense of hypocrisy because, on the one hand, my family were made refugees in 1948 as a result of the actions of the British at the time. And the British bear responsibility for that. And on the other hand, when I speak about Palestine and say I'm Palestinian, there's a complete absence of knowledge or understanding of what that means.
You hear about Palestine, they talk about Palestine, there's a controversy about Palestine, but it's never about Palestinians. It's never from Palestinians. It's never from the Palestinian voice and narrative.
At a time when we're thinking about race and we're reckoning with race as a country and talking about colonialism, talking about slavery, for example, and the history of this country and its role in that, we should also be talking about more recent colonial episodes, and Palestine is part of that story.
What struck me from speaking to the group was how prominent Britain's role in Palestine's past, as well as present, remains in their minds. A part of history I find is rarely known by other people in this country. There's been a lot of controversy in recent months about Winston Churchill and his legacy. But for us Palestinians, there's another British Prime Minister whose role has been much more important in the fate of our country. And that's a guy whose statue is just over my shoulder, David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was Prime Minister in 1917 when Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour issued a public statement on behalf of the British government, announcing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For Palestinians, this was the first in a series of steps that led to the loss of our homeland in 1948. The official Israeli narrative is that upon the creation of the Israeli state, we Palestinians left our homes of our own accord. Avi Schleim is an Israeli historian and a professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. His research has documented that it was part of a wider plan.
I can summarize the history of the British mandate in Palestine between 1920 and 1948 by saying that Britain stole Palestine from the Palestinians, and in 1948, when the first Arab-Israeli war broke out, Britain worked behind the scenes in order to abort the birth of a Palestinian state. So Britain is very largely responsible for the Palestinian tragedy, and yet no British leader has ever accepted responsibility for this tragedy.
Universities are now the battleground over a controversial new definition of anti-Semitism, with the government threatening to withdraw funding unless it is adopted. It prohibits calling the existence of a State of Israel a racist endeavor, even though hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were forcibly displaced in the process, and Israel doesn't recognize our right to self-determination.
The effect is to create censorship and self-censorship because people don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism. What happened in 1948, Israel was responsible for expelling the Palestinians, You're simply talking about historical facts. And the tragedy is that in Britain today, there is no freedom of expression, and Palestinians are not allowed to talk about their history.
Following the events of 1948, what Palestinians know as the Nakba or catastrophe, the majority of us are now refugees. But it's not just politics, it's also the richness of our history and culture that helps bind exiled Palestinians together. But here too, Palestinians are also facing challenges.
Don't overboil them because you don't want them to go too mushy, you want them to stay firm.
Judy Carla is the author of a successful cookbook detailing traditional and very delicious Palestinian food. But she tells me that getting the book published was a struggle due to the word Palestine in the title.
No Palestine on the cover, and giving me options to change it to like orange blossoms and honey or something like this, which is great, but not for what I was doing. I wasn't writing a cookbook to talk about Middle Eastern food. I was writing to talk about my grandmothers and the history of Palestine. I remember doing a press event with 15, if not more, newspapers and magazines, and they all had the dinner, and one by one they told me why they would not be writing about my book. They were asking questions like, where is Palestine? It's not on a map. How can we talk about it if it doesn't exist? You're sort of eradicating, again, just dismissing a whole range of people. Where do they go? Who do they belong to? It's got to stop.
But it's not just Palestinians who feel they are being censored. It's also those advocating on our behalf. War on Want is an anti-poverty charity which campaigns on a number of issues such as workers' rights, food security and the arms trade. But it's the work it does on Palestinian rights that has led to several complaints to the Charity Commission. Repeated investigations found no issues to take forward.
There's a really terrifying precedent created when there's silence created around a single issue. It means that there's going to be silence around other human rights issues also, and that's why people who are the victims of human rights abuse need to be able to speak about it. It creates a chilling effect, and people look and say, oh, well, you know, will I be targeted if I speak up in support of Palestinian rights?
Other charities such as Oxfam and Medical Aid for Palestinians have also faced recent challenges from pro-Israel lawyers which were not upheld. And campaigners have raised concerns with training for the government's counter-terrorism prevent program, listing vocal support for Palestine and opposition to Israeli settlements in Gaza as potential indicators of extremism. They say equating support for Palestinian rights to terrorism helps only to marginalize the Palestinian voice and shut down discussion of Israeli government actions. Free, free! Supporters of Prevent have told us the indicators would only be considered within the context of a broader set of factors. We Palestinians feel that our people and our country are all too often being misrepresented. But surely discussing history, supporting human rights work, or even just writing a cookbook are all perfectly normal activities in a democratic society.
We're a community that is silenced with really strong repressive measures.
It's a campaign that is directly aimed at eliminating Palestinian voices from universities, not by any coincidence, but by design.
My family were expelled from Palestine. Why are we not allowed to talk about, one of the most recent colonial episodes in this country's history?